Next, let's talk about nonverbal communication competence. We're going to talk about some guidelines for both sending and receiving nonverbal messages. Let's start with guidelines for sending nonverbal messages. First, we need to understand that nonverbal communication is multi-channel. So a posture may be combined with a touch or an eye behavior to create what is called a nonverbal cluster. The multi-channel nature of nonverbal communication creates the potential for both increased credibility and increased ambiguity. So we need to increase our awareness of the fact that we might be using multiple channels to send our nonverbal cues, so that we can make sure that the signals that we are sending make sense with one another and the message that we are trying to send. Additionally, we should understand that nonverbal communication affects our interactions. Nonverbal communication affects not only our own behaviors and communication, but it also impacts others' behavior and communication. So we can change our nonverbal signals to affect our own thoughts and emotions. For example, if we are standing in a really frustrated stance, if we're kind of like scrunching our shoulders together and our arms are held close to our body and things like that, generally speaking, the more frustrated we become. It's a feedback cycle. And if we can make conscious moves to change our nonverbal communication, we might be able to break those negative cycles and change our cognitive and emotional states as well. In addition, we should understand how nonverbal communication creates rapport. Humans have evolved this innate urge to mirror one another's behavior. Think, for example, about how people tend to fall into formation, especially when it comes to waiting in a line. For example, I was seeing Hamilton in San Francisco a couple of years ago, and when I approached the building, there was this long line around the building, and I had never seen this before. I had been to this theater several times, and generally speaking, when people were waiting to get into the theater, they simply clustered in the foyer underneath the marquee, and everyone just entered the theater that way. And all of these people were waiting in line, and I just stood in underneath the marquee where I would normally stand and went straight into the building, not waiting in the line that didn't need to exist. The only reason that the line existed was because we have this subconscious practice to match the nonverbal cues of people around us. It sends this implicit message of, look, I'm just like you, and it makes it so that we blend in rather than sticking out away from the crowd. So we have to understand how nonverbal communication operates to make us a part of the group. In addition, we should understand how nonverbal communication regulates conversations. We have to be able to encode the appropriate turn-taking signals in our conversations to ensure that we can hold the floor when we have something important to say, or that we can successfully pass the baton when we want to invite others into the conversation. These nonverbal cues can also help us to make sure that we aren't inappropriately interrupting someone or potentially being rude to them. So we have to understand those nonverbal cues and how they act to regulate conversations. Additionally, we should work to understand how nonverbal communication relates to listening. When we are listening to someone, we are sending them nonverbal feedback all the time in the form of head nods, eye contact, and posture. And all of these things can signal that a listener is paying attention and that a speaker's message is being received and understood. And finally, we should try to understand how nonverbal communication relates to impression management. Being nonverbally expressive, especially during initial interactions, can lead to much more favorable impressions of us. So doing things like smiling, keeping an attentive posture, or offering a solid handshake can communicate things like confidence and enthusiasm that can be really useful in situations like a first date or a job interview. So overall, we should become more aware of how nonverbal communication and the nonverbal messages that we are sending impacts the different instances of communication that we are participating in.